Welcome to Revolutions Weekly, where we dive into the details of our many periodic revolutions, elections. I'm your host Alvin, and this week is going to be quite a big week because we're talking about a huge election, a major election, especially when it comes to world politics. So, if you tuned into my episode last week, you'd know that this week we'll be talking about the Iranian presidential elections for 2021. So, as of the recording of this podcast, funnily enough, the polls for that election has actually just closed. So essentially the results, it'll take about a few hours from, as of right now to basically what it would be in Iran midday for the results to come out or any semblance of the results. And so because of that, because of just how major this election is, I kind of want to do two parts then essentially. So this part will be primarily dedicated to, telling you the context, telling you the big issues, and just things with the polls and stuff like that. And with the next episode, we're gonna be looking at the results and just kind of going from there, kind of infer what might this mean for Iranian politics, what this might mean for the future of Iran, what this might mean for the future of the Middle East, and even global politics in general. So anyways, let's get started. So in case you didn't know, so Iran, with how the Middle East is often, viewed, it's always viewed as this place where, theocracy reigns and where, religious fundamentalism is just everywhere. Well, I mean, that is certainly the case with a lot of countries, the Gulf states especially. But, in the case of Iran, Iran has always had this unique historical trajectory, especially when it comes to the Middle East. So, so Iran actually, has always been a full-fledged democracy since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So basically, before this, in case you don't know, they basically had a constitutional monarchical system, basically. So where the Shah of Iran is basically, like the so-called symbolic head of the state, but at the same time, he's also head of government, or at least acted like a head of government, because it's just how much power he has basically over Iranian society. But that all changed in 1979 when he got deposed, and since then we've kind of had this consistent form of democracy, especially since 1981. So early on it was a bit tumultuous, so a lot of people got impeached, a lot of people got assassinated. It was a whole thing. So basically, since 1981 we've had a consistent every 4 years where the president gets elected. So, and interestingly enough, the first president to come out of this stable period is Ali Khamenei. Now, in case you don't know who Ali Khamenei is actually currently the supreme leader of Iran. So, of course, if you know somebody by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini, so, the guy who actually started the revolution, so he's his successor, basically. But, I digress. So now let's actually kind of get to more or less what the Iranian system actually looks like. So, to outside observers, Iran might either appear as a fully democratic nation or as a fully theocratic nation. But the truth is, it's kind of somewhere in the middle, where basically theocratic elements and republican elements are basically mixed in together. So, on the one hand, for the side of theocracy, you have a supreme leader, the Ayatollah, basically. So, he's both the religious leader, the spiritual leader of the country. But, unlike a head of state, he actually has lots of power in regards to Iranian policy, in regards to just the fact that he can veto a lot of the things that the other bodies come up with. So this supreme leader is chosen actually by an assembly of experts with 86 members elected every 8 years. So there is some element of democracy there, but it's democracy in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean a country is fully democratic, and we'll get to that in a bit. And at the same time, the supreme leader has the power to appoint something called the Guardian Council, which has a lot of power in Iran, including, relevant to this episode, choosing candidates for the presidential election. So the supreme leader gets to choose 6 candidates, whereas the president gets to choose 6 more, basically. So, so within the constitution, technically, the parliament and president, the executive, legislative, the more republican, the more democratic elements of Iranian government is technically equal to this more religious side of it, in that, they could make policy and the other side could have a say in the amendments and things like that, and but not necessarily vice versa. So I take that back. So basically, the theocracy is still supreme, but there are democratic elements, and they have a lot of free reign when it comes to economics and just like like more secular matters, shall we say. So technically they are equal, but of course, at times the Ayatollah might kind of like enforce his own views, his own policies on the executive branch, on the presidency, on the parliament, things like that. And because of this, there's always this tension between the more secular elements of Iranian government as well as the more religious elements of it, where the religious elements tend to be a bit more conservative, whereas and as the more secular elements tend to be a lot more pragmatic, a lot more practical about things. But anyways, so before I actually go into the election itself, the candidates and things like that, something you should know about Iranian politics is that, there's basically two factions within Iranian society and as well as Iranian politics. And it's basically the Reformist and the Principalist. Now, just from hearing that, you can actually probably infer what both each of those sides actually stand for. The Reformists, just quickly, of course, it's for a more progressive, a more open Iran. So, the ones who are like a lot more practical, the ones who like a lot more, now I wouldn't say leftist, but certainly a lot more centrist, a lot more like basically like they're more willing to like negotiate with the world, they're more willing to like engage in diplomacy and things like that, to basically like move on from like the dogmatic past and towards a more progressive future. So in this camp, there's only ever really been two presidents. So Muhammad Khatami, who was president from 1997 to 2005. So he was the first reformist president. And, he was basically the one who like kind of pioneered this like reformist movement basically within Iranian politics, like as a legitimate faction. And secondly, the current guy, Hassan Rouhani. And under his administration, we've kind of had a lot of like interesting developments, from just like in general, like the more opening up of Iranian society, like most notably, with like the JCPOA, which is like the Iran nuclear deal, which now kind of like is a bit in limbo as to like what's going to happen with that. But, but under him, that happened. So you see like the more, like the more inclination here towards diplomacy and things like that. Now, of course, on the other side, we have the Principalist, who, as you might be able to guess, is more dogmatic, is a lot more conservative, is a lot more closed off, like at least like not necessarily as policy, but just with just how Iran has been treated, over the years in world diplomacy, especially by the West. They've kind of ended up, like we're preferring to like close off more to the West and like kind of opening up more to China and Russia, for example. Of course, you have like the really, like religious, the really Islamist elements of this faction, but then you also have, some more secular people who are just simply Iranian conservatives, like, for example, like famously Ahmadinejad, who was the president before Rouhani. So he was, for example, a principalist president. So basically every other president besides the two that I mentioned above are principalist, or could categorized as principalist for the most part. And, in terms of the parliament, like they're basically these two factions kind of like are, form of like multiple political parties, but they kind of like group each other up with these two big camps. So currently, as it stands in parliament, there's actually a huge principalist dominance. And it kind of tells you what the trajectory of Iranian society will be for, at least the next 5-6 years. So, they had an election for the parliament in 2020, and basically the results was the principalists got 221 seats, and the reformists only got 20. So you see what I mean? It's the very lopsided thing. And, there's a couple of independents and like minority parties and things like that in the mix. But, in terms of like our two big factions, that's basically the case. Now, you might be thinking, it's like, oh, does that mean that, Iranian society is just too conservative to be able to accept a lot of these reforms? Not necessarily, because in 2016, for example, we have kind of like a reverse where the Principalist has 83 seats and the Reformist has 121. So you see there's more of a reformist dominance in this case, albeit there is also like about 100 independents with varying political inclinations. But basically we kind of have like a reformist dominance in the last parliament, so it's not always like a stable thing necessarily. And basically with just like how bad the economic situation in Iran has been, I think that kind of like explains like the more like polarizing, the more drastic margins, ratios in the current parliament. But we'll definitely get to that. So Just before I get to the candidates again, like just quickly, like what are the main issues in this election? So I think it's like, again, COVID, and like with Iran's case specifically, COVID has been particularly bad for them. So if you remember early on, like in the pandemic, you kind of hear a lot about like how Iran is this like first Middle Eastern country to like actually, just be completely wrecked by COVID, basically. And like there's not exactly a good situation right now either. And just with like how like they've been like sanctioned and things like that by the West, it's not exactly easy getting medicines, vaccines, and things like that. So it's definitely been really hectic to them COVID wise. And getting to what I just said earlier, it gets to my second point basically about economic sanctions. So so Iran has kind of been in like a rough patch for like the last few decades, just simply because, for the simple reason that they've been sanctioned by the West. And because they're sanctioned by the West, it blocks a lot of things, from technology, from a lot of potential customers for their goods, to export, things like that. And most recently, yeah, COVID goods, to help with the aid of COVID-19, goods, like vaccines, mask machines and things like that. It's like, so if they're sanctioned, well, then they can only really get these things from China and Russia, which have their own domestic issues, and which kind of like are like inherently a lot more limited than the United States, for example. So it's been like a pretty tenuous situation for them, and COVID has basically only exacerbated it a lot more. And this idea of sanctions by the West, that's why whereas the Principalist would like to just say screw the West, let's just go with China and Russia, the Reformist would actually like to open up relations with the West, and hence we see this in things like the Iran nuclear deal and stuff like that. So that's basically kind of like the two approaches that we have to like this huge problem, this like overbearing, this dominant problem of sanctions. And that's basically what's been underpinning a lot of like the dynamics of politics within Iran. So now, enough dilly-dallying, let's get to the candidates. So first of all, we have a guy by the name of Ebrahim Raisi, who's currently the Chief Justice of Iran, actually. And he's part of the party called the CCA, or the Combative Scholars Association. Not really a political party, but definitely a big organization and part of the Principalist camp. So he's of course, like I said, Principalist, and he's actually, interestingly enough, ran once before against Hassan Rouhani in the last election. But of course, Hassan Rouhani won a second term, but he got about 38% of the vote. So he's definitely a prominent figure in Iran, and he's definitely a guy who has a lot of following. But like, of course, like in this case, there is some controversy as well, because Ebrahim Raisi, actually, like being, like in the judiciary system for decades, essentially, he's been responsible for basically a lot of like the more controversial elements of Iran's justice system, where he basically kind of like, like I think 1988, for example, there was this huge trial with like a whole bunch of like activists and things like that, and basically they were all like killed, basically. So that's basically why he's basically also known as the blood judge, for example. So that's interesting as well. Like was like internationally, he's actually kind of like condemned. He's actually kind of like, I think, sanctioned by the government, for example. So he's a very controversial figure, but in Iran he has a pretty decent following and a decent chance of winning. So the next candidate is Mohsen Rezai, who's a longtime member of the Iranian parliament. He's part of the RFII, the Resistance Front of Islamic Iran, and he's a principalist as well. And then we have Amir Hossein Ghazizadeh Hashemi, who's an independent, technically running in this election, and he was actually a member of previously the Front of Islamic Revolutionary Stability. So that can kind of tell you that he's also a principalist. And now, lastly, we have Abdul Nasser Hemati, who's a different candidate than the other three. So he's head of the central bank currently, and he's pretty close to Hassan Rouhani. So, because of that, it puts him firmly in the Reformist camp. So he's part of the Executives of Construction of Iran, which is like another political organization. So, out of like the four candidates, basically, we have one reformist and three principalists. But, it's a kind of like a lopsided race. And initially, you actually had 7 candidates. So you actually had 2 principalists and 1 reformist. Now, they probably all dropped out for various reasons, but, a likely reason perhaps is vote consolidation and just like kind of like, like the things that are going on behind the scene that's encouraging them, that's enticing them to kind of like drop out ultimately. And but then like in terms of like, like what the race ultimately is about, like I said, there were 4 candidates, but really the way it's being portrayed in the media is it's really a two-way race between Ibrahim Raisi, representing the Principalist, and Abdul Nasser Hemati, representing the Reformist. Now, there are definitely a lot of, like more stronger reformist, politicians in Iran, that and Abdul Nasser Hemati is definitely not one of them. He's a good guy, he's a pretty like smart economist and things like that, but he's definitely not a guy with any sort of charisma, nowhere near as much charisma, for example, as Hassan Rouhani, who's been able to, through his own like personality, his own like good policies, to basically kind of like push for the reformist side of politics. Whereas, Abdul Nasser Hemati is a relatively weak figure, and this basically will reflect in the polls, which we'll get to in a bit. But, basically, you see kind of like how it's lopsided in favor of the Principalists and things like that. This is not by coincidence. At least it isn't to, like, the more liberal elements of Iranian society. And because, because they kind of see this, as a deliberate manipulation of the system, there's actually a pretty huge movement going on in Iran currently to actually boycott this particular election. So, and like to be fair, they're kind of like somewhat justified in that assessment. So, as I said earlier, the way candidates are chosen is that they have to go through the Golden Council. Now, the Golden Council, like I said earlier, is basically kind of appointed by the president. At least 6 of the members are appointed by the president, but another 6 of the members is by the supreme leader. So basically, like they have the final say basically on like who gets to run as president and who doesn't. So basically, out of 600 candidates, including some pretty strong reformist candidates, only one actually ended up being on the ballot, which is, which kind of like tells you that, there's what some people are saying is that, there's like some things going on in the back, there's some manipulation and things like that. And at the same time, that, basically this election is kind of just a formality, and that they're basically just giving the red carpet, as it were, to Ibrahim Raisi. So Ibrahim Raisi is, basically in this case, not only being appointed basically as the next president, but there's even some rumors that's saying that, he might even be the next supreme leader, replacing Khamenei basically. So, and interestingly enough, so Khamenei himself actually used to be president. So we might be seeing something similar here with Ibrahim Raisi in his inauguration, or as some people like to say, coronation as president. So you see, it's like because of like this disenfranchisement with, the Iranian system of like what is supposed to be democratic, turnout is basically expected to be as low as 40% in this particular election, which, is kind of unfortunate because Iranian elections usually have a pretty high turnout, especially, early on in the revolution, with like, numbers reaching 70 to 80% typically. So, to see something as low as 40% is definitely unprecedented and kind of brings into question the actual legitimacy of the system itself in the future. So, just final things before I close it off, let's finally get to the polls. So, as of right now, as I was saying earlier, with like how there's a boycott amongst the reformists, and at the same time how, they're basically making it all go in favor of Ibrahim Raisi, the polls kind of like reflect that somewhat. So what we have is basically Raisi is expected to get 64% of all the votes cast, and Hemati, the reformist candidate, is only expected to get 4.2, which this goes back to what I was saying. And like he's a good guy. He's certainly a, like a technocrat, but he's no Hassan Rouhani. He's no Mohammad Khatami. He's not this charismatic leader who can actually garner proper support. So he has 4% and Raisi has 64%. So we kind of know where this election's going more or less. And, the fact that only about 40% of people say they would actually definitely vote, kind of tells you what the state of the Iranian system actually is, and like kind of tells you what Iranian democracy will probably look like in the future, unless there's a huge reform or there's a huge movement against, against this whole tinkering issue. So in terms of the actual results, they haven't come out yet. So I'll be doing an episode probably a day or two from now, going through these results exactly, with you. And If in the future we have similar situations with, like a nice major election, we'll definitely do the same thing as well. I'm trying to get more content out there in general. And, and if you guys like, a lot of these more like, two-parter, a lot of these like more in-depth kind of episodes, do let me know in the comments, on if you're on YouTube, for example. But just in general, that's all I gotta say for now. And, if you're on Spotify, if you're on all these other podcast platforms, give this podcast a follow, share it with your friends, helps a lot. And if you're on YouTube, comment, like, subscribe, and just kind of tell me what you think the results will be, what this kind of tells you about Iranian politics. And, something I haven't really done yet is, just tell me what you want me to cover, what elections, what political issues, what electoral issues, what figures, like whose biographies you want me to cover. Just totally, go wild. So that's all I have for you this week. Not this week. So that's all I have for you for now. See ya in the next episode.